Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Jamie Lavin, a member of the Government Innovation Team at Bloomberg Philanthropies. I know today is a challenging day in this country, and our thoughts are with all those whose lives have been impacted by gun violence. We appreciate the effort you, as city leaders, make each day to build stronger communities, and we're grateful for the opportunity to partner with you to move our cities forward. The Federal Assistance E311 program, a partnership between Bloomberg Philanthropies, the United States Conference of Mayors, is focused on helping cities navigate the unprecedented levels of federal funding available to cities through traditional programs like FEMA and HUD, the American Rescue Plan, and now the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. As many of you know from participating in the program, we've retained federal funding experts to help you navigate issues from eligible uses of funds to policies and procedures to prevent fraud, waste, and abuse. You can submit your questions through our program site or schedule one-on-one calls to walk through some of the trickier issues with our experts. Since our launch in May of 2021, over 4,500 city leaders and over 1,100 cities have accessed the program support. Last week, we announced a new partnership with the United States Conference of Mayors, National League of Cities, and Results for America to help cities apply for infrastructure funding. The local infrastructure hub will expand on the work we've been doing in the E311 program to bring more resources to cities to help understand the $1.2 trillion in available infrastructure funding and create transformative projects that improve residents' lives. Today, we're happy to have experts at IEM, James Clark and Cambry Scott, here to discuss strategies your city can use to select which community projects to fund with American Rescue Plan dollars. Following their presentation, we'll welcome your questions. Thank you to my colleagues, Rose Gill and Adam Freed, and to our partners at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Dave Gatton, Laura Waxman, and David Burns, for your partnership and leadership with this program. Thank you well to our program administrator, Cobray and Kim, for their stewardship of today's program development. Now I'd like to turn it over to James Clark at IEM.
Thank you, Jamie. So as Jamie introduced, I'm James Clark and I'm their Director of Response and Recovery at IEM. I've been able to help my community and a number of communities throughout the country with managing federal grant funds for about 13 years now. Most recently with the American Rescue Plan, really welcome the partnership that we've had with the folks at Bloomberg and Cobray and Kim and the other expert partners, and are going to share a little bit today about what we have learned in our last year or so of American Rescue Plan. So joining me today is Cambry Scott, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Cambry Scott. I'm a project manager with IEM. I have about 14 years of experience in dealing with federal grant funding, and I am happy to be here and help to answer any questions you may have.
All right, we can move on. So what we're going to talk about today, as wonderful as the American Rescue Plan funding is, it has such broad latitude that it does create some challenges in figuring out exactly what you want to do with the money, how you will justify it, and how you will be transparent with your community on how you select those projects. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the definitions and references in the final rule that tie to what populations are to be targeted as you deliver benefit to your community. We're going to talk about some of the public programs that are cited in the final rule that can be utilized to give you a head start in identifying the appropriate recipients of funding. Some of the public data sources that are out there that you can utilize, that you can easily pull down and use to evaluate projects and recipients of funds. And what we've done for several of our clients is actually use these programs and these data sources to create a framework by which we can evaluate how well these different grant opportunities are going to impact the appropriate parts of your population in your community, and then how you can demonstrate that you've had an equitable and objective selection process. Not just for who will receive the funds, but also for who you will partner with to actually manage the funds. Also, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the metrics that you can collect and some of the outputs for reporting that you can create and the public transparency that you can demonstrate as an outcome of using these data sources. And then we'll just talk about some of the overall benefits before we get into questions. So with that, we can move forward. I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges. So as wonderful as it is, the flexible funding does make it difficult for you to create an equitable and objective selection process. There are so many things that you can spend the money on. It's up to community leaders to determine how they will spend the money. And even once they determine what they're going to spend the money on, there's still criteria that has to be established and governance around who will receive money, how much, even if you choose whether it's going to be on infrastructure or feeding, et cetera. So our community leaders don't want to be in a position where they have to defend their subjective decision-making. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can try to make objective decisions. It's also going to tie in with the compliance rules for American Rescue Plan. If you can easily demonstrate that you have served the appropriate portions of your community and that you've had an equitable process, you can avoid any audit findings and having to pay any funding back to Treasury. One of the other issues that we've seen with our clients is there's been an overwhelming number of ideas on how to spend the money. And with all these different asks, many of them are addressing needs in the community. They're all going to benefit the community. And so now you've got these competing organizations with these ideas, and you're forced into that position of choosing who gets the money. So we can help you to figure out a way to do that without the subjective decision making that will open you up to scrutiny. So with that, we're going to move on, and I'm going to let Camry talk a little bit about what is in the final rule that tells you what communities that you should target.
So as mentioned in the chat, this presentation will be available for you to refer back to, so don't be concerned if you don't get every single reference. The American Rescue Plan was designed to alleviate the negative public health and economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the final rule identifies populations and communities negatively impacted or disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. If you use these categories that have already been defined within the Treasury, it allows for you to respond to a broad set of households without further justification. So essentially what it's saying is, if you use those, then it would allow you to choose programs and basically demonstrate your equity as far as making sure that you are using the funding for those targeted audiences or intended uses. Next slide. So there are programs that are cited in the final rule that have already established databases of information that can be used for your metrics and rubrics for potential program uses. These programs include, for impacted households, the Children Health and Insurance Program, Child Care Subsidies through Child Care, the CCDF program, Medicaid, the National Housing Trust Fund, and Home Investment Partnership Program. It is important to note that if you use the database for the housing program, that it is only for affordable housing programs only. You'll be serving your target populations, and you can easily demonstrate to your Treasury and constituents that you have used the funds in an objective and meaningful manner. Next slide. These programs outlined disproportionately impacted households, and those are two different definitions that are also cited within the final rule. So these are federal programs such as TANF, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, SNAP, Section 8 vouchers, Pell Grant recipients, and for services are programs to address educational disparities. Treasury will recognize Title I eligible schools and services that support the schools as eligible. So they already meet the requirements. Basically, if you choose one of these selected definitions, then your funding, you don't have to do any further analysis. So next we'll talk about some public data sources that are available that will also help you to outline.
Next slide.
So these public data sources help you meet Treasury requirements also. They're available for you online. They already include those data sets for you. And they are the CDC, Census Bureau, USDA, Policy Map, which is a website that can be found online, policymap.com, and FBI Uniform Crime Report. Now I'm going to turn it back over to James, and we're going to discuss how these resources and databases that I just used can be utilized for reporting and transparency purposes.
Okay. So we've talked about a number of different programs that are out there. The point of these programs and looking at these data sources is that you can ensure you are serving the right parts of your community, and you can actually take that information and also display it a number of ways. So first, you've got to figure out, if you already know how you want to spend your money, but you need to figure out where you're going to spend your money, you need to define what data sources you want to utilize. So of those data sources that we had on the previous slide, you can pull down any number of those. Once you understand the population you want to serve and you pull down that data, you can develop how you want to measure or score grant concepts. And you may not be scoring the actual grant concepts, you may be scoring or evaluating what partners you want to select to work on. So you may have a number of different partners that are providing food to the public, but you can ask them what areas they serve, and then you can use this publicly available data to select partners that are serving the proper target communities. So next slide. What we have done, and there's just a quick snapshot here on the left, but we went through a large public outreach effort and hosted meetings across the state with one of our clients at the state level. We collected all of these different concepts on how different partners, potential partners, wanted to spend the American Rescue Plan funding. We first mapped them back to, at the time, the interim rule, then the final rule, what eligible use they were looking to spend the money to fund. And then we actually went through a process and collected these different data sources, mapped them out from a GIS perspective, and we were able to evaluate projects by how well they would impact the target communities. So what we came out with was really just a scoring evaluation that we could provide then to our clients, and then the state had the ability to use that as their objective selection method, so that they didn't have to justify to the public. And they actually have a public transparency page where everybody can go and see all the different program ideas that were collected, how they were evaluated for eligibility, and then how they were evaluated for how well they would impact the target community, to see how they were selected and how much money was funded for what purpose. So moving on. So to talk about some of the benefits, this can be used a number of different ways. As I mentioned, you can go through the selection for actual projects this way. You could also use this to select what partners you would want to work with, that would be the subrecipients that would actually implement programs. And you could also use it to just demonstrate to the public where the money was spent and where the benefit was received within your community. So that public transparency, I think, has a lot of value. You can also set some metrics for what you want to accomplish with your funding. And you can then map out how well you've accomplished those outcomes that you set out on at the beginning of your program. So moving on. That really concludes everything that we wanted to walk through today, but we do welcome any questions. And Jamie, I think that you also were going to provide an opportunity for the City of Atlanta.
Yes, thank you so much, James and Cambray. Today, Melodie Eccles, who's the Assistant Director for American Rescue Plan Local Fiscal Recovery Fund Programs for Invest Atlanta, is joining us. And we had a call last week where she outlined what Atlanta is doing. I'd love to share that with the participants in today's program. Melodie?
Sure, thanks, Jamie, and thank you, James and Cambry, for the presentation. Super helpful. Yeah, happy to share what Atlanta is doing. As Jamie mentioned, I'm Melodie Eccles. I'm with Invest Atlanta. Invest Atlanta is the City of Atlanta's economic development agency. So we do a lot of programming on behalf of the city. The city essentially contracts us out to do their economic development and community development efforts. So the City of Atlanta received a good portion of ARP funds. And of the funds they received, they allocated just about $25 million to Invest Atlanta to program towards small business, technical assistance, and workforce development efforts. So the biggest program that we have is called the Resurgence Grant Fund. It's a grant fund program for small businesses and nonprofits to reimburse them for some of the COVID-related expenses they've incurred since March 3rd, 2021 and later. Applications actually closed this week, so we've had a good turnout of applications received. But again, the idea is just to reimburse them for some of the costs incurred. They can include commercial rent, expenses, payroll, and just anything that was necessary for their business to operate during COVID. Could be PPE, could be some investment in technical assistance, anything that they've had to invest in to go virtual or to accommodate for social distancing, things of that nature. Similar to the CARES Act intention, we had a similar program for that. But with ARP, of course, we have some lessons learned from the CARES Act. We had a similar application process, and we realized that there were some barriers for businesses. One of the big differences that actually Cambry touched on was that you could identify a group or a population of applicants or individuals who could be eligible based on financial hardship. So one thing that Invest Atlanta has done so that we don't have to ask businesses to provide their financial statements, do that financial analysis to show that they had a loss or a financial hardship, is that we've compiled different sources of data to establish that on behalf of small businesses in City of Atlanta as a whole. So they don't have to provide that. And that has removed a tremendous barrier for that. Because we've eliminated that barrier, we also can include nonprofits to the legislation. We have, like I mentioned, tons of applicants, which brings up the question of how do we select who receives these grant funds, because we only have so much to go around, obviously. But we have created a scoring matrix. We have a completely external scoring committee where at least 3 scoring committee members will look at each application and score them based on different criteria. A lot of it is location-based. Are they in a qualified census tract as defined by ARP? Are they in certain priority areas of the city, historically disinvested areas, low to moderate income census tracts, things of that nature. We look into how much funding that they've received since all of the COVID relief funding has come about. So a business who maybe has already received $150,000 in relief funds versus a business who's maybe only received $5,000 to $10,000 probably wouldn't score as much in that category. And then we also just factor in, we have a couple narrative questions on, how is your business impacted and what are your plans moving forward to make sure that your business can remain in operation in this new environment. So we factor those in. We try to make it a fair scoring process as much as possible. And those scores will ultimately determine grant awards. And so that's the big program. We also have a technical assistance program where we issued an RFP for technical assistance providers. And we just kind of kept it wide open, a wide range of services we wanted to be able to provide. And we ended up contracting with over a dozen technical assistance service providers to provide financial services, business planning, HR, bookkeeping, marketing, really, you name it. We have a wide range of services available, and it's at no cost to our businesses as long as they are a business within the city of Atlanta. They have their business license. Again, we're using those sources of data to make the case that small businesses in Atlanta as a whole were affected by COVID. They can access those resources, and so they enter into an agreement with the technical assistance service providers themselves, and then the technical assistance service providers just invoice Invest Atlanta on a monthly basis to cover the cost of those services. We have an online platform that we've established, and it's kind of like a Match.com for small businesses and the technical assistance providers. They can kind of shop around and see who the best provider will be to meet their needs. And then we also have another program focused on workforce development. It's in partnership with WorkSource Atlanta, and its intent is to, first of all, help staff up some of the city's public works department to get them back to pre-COVID staffing levels. That was the first intent of that program. And then after that, we go even broader to, okay, how can we provide resources to help these individuals upskill and have access to a higher paying middle wage job? For not only those program participants, but anyone in that vulnerable population in the city. That program's still kind of in the build out phase. We're still figuring out the selection criteria for those program participants, but we issued out an RFP for a service provider to help provide that job training and kind of wraparound services. We did make an intentional effort to make sure that it's paid job training. We want to address the fact that, a lot of people maybe want to take advantage of the training, but they can't take off of the job that they already have and then pay for, transportation and childcare and things of that nature. So we want to make it as accessible as possible. So to be paid job training, wraparound services will be covered, things of that nature. So those are the big programs that Invest Atlanta is working on. We did staff up pretty well to help cover the administration of it. We have 7 full-time positions strictly working on these ARP programs, a couple program managers. We have a couple small business advocates who are really just, their role is to be that kind of liaison between the business owners and Invest Atlanta, answering their initial questions, pointing them in the right direction, and just hearing what are some of the pain points so that we can receive that feedback and adjust accordingly if we need to. And then I will also mention, we also partnered with a project management firm to help with our Resurgence Grant Fund program so that we are getting through all the applications as efficiently as possible. So there's a whole separate team of application processors that we're using, a local staffing agency to help provide those resources. So that's what's going on in Atlanta. That was a lot, but happy to answer any questions or continue the conversation.
Melodie, thank you so much for sharing that. I'm sure you'll be getting taken advantage of on that offer for to answer questions. The first question that we received today was from Joanne Check. Joanne, are you able to come on camera and ask your question?
Hi, yeah. We had a question on whether or not there are any stipulations in the federal rule that require proof of legal presence for the people that we serve.
I'm happy to take that if you'd like, Jamie. So Joanne, I have looked, in fact, I was looking as I saw your post in the chat, and there is no specific requirement for you to establish that legal presence. However, it is a good practice because there is the potential that if you can't demonstrate that it went, that there was some sort of fraud potential, then you could end up with a clawback in the future. So you could do that a few different ways to try to cover yourself. you know, not necessarily going and knocking on a door, but by requiring, you know, maybe a utility bill, or, you know, if it's actually someone that is already being served in other programs and you're using the database from another program named in the act to, you know, demonstrate that they're eligible, and that's one of your criteria, then that protects you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Ahmad. Ahmad, would you mind asking on camera?
Yep. Hi, everyone. Ahmad Rivera-Wagner from the city of Green Bay. Just a question that has come up several times. Qualified census tracts were one of the things that we're tackling here is a housing crisis that has been made worse by the pandemic. And there are several different data sources that will give you different types of qualified census tracts. The difference between a HUD-based one or a general 80% of median income to other types of forms of concentrated poverty. So I saw that you had the census data as one of the data sources, but there is actually multiple definitions of qualified census tracts, and we've gone with the most conservative that is with HUD, which is based on isn't even based on the most recent census, but we were trying to figure out if there was a greater impact area if we were utilizing other types of data sources or newer data sources for qualified census tracts.
So HUD would be the most appropriate, and what I have seen, there is not a specific requirement tying to that qualified census tract. And in fact, there is not a specific requirement requiring you to use any of these methods that are listed in the final rule. You can make your own methodology for targeting these vulnerable populations. It just makes your life a little easier when you can go to something that's already established. So to answer your question, there is no specific requirement. You can choose any of the qualified census tract data sources that you would like, or create something of your own. However, what I have seen most common has been the HUD data sets that for the low to moderate income, which I believe is what you were referencing.
I think our next question is from Daniela Leon. Daniela, are you able to come on screen and ask your question?
Hello, I think my video is loading. Okay, you can see, okay. Thanks, my name is Daniela. I'm from City of Buffalo, Resiliency Grants Manager. My question was about folks' different approach to engagement. So how are you ensuring, or how are you measuring that the way you engage the community is effective, or it's working? Are you treating engagement as a continuous process? Are you thinking about it as a continuous process, or are you more looking at kind of instances?
Well, that sounds like a bit of a crowdsourcing question. So certainly would be happy for any of the other, jurisdictions to chime in, but I can tell you from my perspective what I've seen. So you've got engagement and transparency, similar but two different things. For transparency, we've actually set up a public transparency website. It shows all the projects that have come in as applications, shows how we have scored them, how we've selected. For those that have been selected, how much money is going to them, what portion of the population they will serve. And then as money goes out, you can see how much money has been spent on any of these individual programs. So I think that that's a pretty good way to establish public transparency. The size and the value of the programs you're implementing will kind of drive that. I don't know that you necessarily have to go through the same level of effort. For community engagement, there was a large outreach up front to engage the public, let them know that this existed. The notice of funding opportunities that were put out included what the criteria for the program was and who it was intended to serve. And then up front, there was also a very large collection of concepts and ideas of how that money could be spent.
Great, and I invite other cities to share what they've been doing on engagement while we're sort of waiting for those cities to come in. I'll call on Eric Burnett and ask your question.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Eric Burnett. I'm the Director of Innovation in Louisville, Kentucky. So I have a question that's sort of, it is related to ARP, but it's kind of broader than that. And that is, do any of your cities have funds set aside for matching federal grants? This became an issue for us with the ARP because of the EDA grants and I think a few others, but it's becoming an even bigger issue for the infrastructure law. But every time there's a NOFO that comes out that requires a match, we are scrambling to find money to use as the local match for it. So I was just wondering if any of your cities have like pools of money set aside for that purpose.
So I just want to confirm the question. Is the question the ability to mix and match funding sources and to use federal funds from one source as a match for another, or actually setting aside your own general fund dollars for matching?
The second thing.
Well, yes, some communities are setting aside general fund dollars, but in some cases, they are actually spending these federal grant dollars on existing programs that they already have. So they already inherently have the dollars going towards that purpose. And then there's also cases where folks have set up public-private partnerships where some of the money is being privately funded. So I don't know how well that answers your question, but there is a lot of different ways to go. And as long as you are not duplicating from more than one funding source, you've got a lot of latitude.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example from Louisville. We ended up, so we're in the finals right now for the Build Back Better Regional Challenge. The city has ended up putting $3 million up of general fund money as the local match, along with several other partners. So I think our total coalition match is 12 million or something. But we were just kind of lucky that we had that $3 million. If we hadn't had that, we wouldn't be in the finals probably, So I guess I'm trying to get Louisville to a place where we can be more proactive about having the resources to compete.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for American Rescue Plan funds specifically, there's not a matching requirement. You can get pretty creative with other federal programs, but they each have their own rules. So for instance, HUD funds lose their federal designation and can be used as matching funds for other programs. But ultimately, each program is going to have its own rules. So that's kind of a tough one to answer. Setting up funds in advance for unknown future grant matching is not something that I've seen a lot of.
I think, James, you've noted before, I think that that the ARPA dollars can be used as matching funds for some of these other federal programs, right?
Yes.
Is that true with infrastructure projects as well?
Yes, infrastructure projects, you could potentially use American Rescue Plan infrastructure dollars, or the infrastructure eligible uses. If it meets the eligible uses of both programs, you can match those funds.
Great. And if any other cities have what Eric is asking about, have sort of dedicated funds for match, we'd love to hear about it in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand. I'll turn next to Melissa Wilson.
Thank you. So my question is, if you have a project that has multiple funding sources, ARPA is one of the funding sources, but say HUD or CDBG is also another source in that particular project, they have different regulations. So which funding sources regulations should you follow? The most restrictive, which would be CDBG in this case, or does it apply to the entirety of the project, or just the portion of the project that is being funded by those particular sources?
So that's a great question. It's bit complicated. Basically, you have to follow the rules of each program for the portion of the program that's being funded by those dollars. It could be complicated if you say, with American Rescue Plan, there's no match. But if you have a program that does have a match and 75% of the dollars comes from that program, 100% of the dollars must follow that program's rules because it requires that match. If there is HUD and American Rescue Plan that are both funding portions of a project, then you would just have to follow the rules for that program. In essence, you have to submit the documentation to meet the standards for each program individually for any dollars that program is going to fund. It does get a little interesting in some cases where federal agencies conflict, but I don't think you're going to see that with American Rescue Plan. You do see that between FEMA and HUD. And in that case, there's been a lot of back and forth. There was actually a law passed several years ago forcing federal agencies to practice reciprocity, for instance, in how they evaluate environmental and historic preservation. But it also gets interesting with prevailing wages for HUD funding, where you're required to follow the Davis-Bacon Act. So I don't know if I gave you a little bit too much, but does it at least answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great. And now maybe I'll turn to Melodie. We've gotten a few questions for Melodie in the chat. One was from Kathleen Long from Patterson. Kathleen, do you want to ask your question to Melodie?
Great. Thanks, Jamie. Hi, everybody. I love that idea of the technical assistance. And I was just curious, who is taking that up in your community? Are you seeing a range of kind of from the small businesses to medium sized to large? And a little bit on, in addition to what I put in the chat, is how did you get the word out, and that what you felt was the most effective about that component? Because I think it is really unique.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have restricted our program to small businesses. We're defining that as businesses that have 250 or less employees. I will say the vast majority of businesses that take advantage of our programming have nowhere near that number of employees. It's very small businesses. And we really, selected a wide range of service providers so that we can touch kind of, anywhere from I just registered with Secretary of State. How do I get my business license? How do I, become compliant with the city? To, I have had this business for years. Now I'm ready to grow. Or I need to pivot my entire business model because of COVID. Like, this brick and mortar isn't working for me anymore. I want to go virtual. So it really kind of runs the gamut, but it is for small businesses. We do try to, we do a lot of outreach. We try to do some more targeted outreach for our historically disinvested communities and our legacy businesses that have just been here a while and, maybe just we have a lot of older mom and pop type businesses that just aren't aware of some of the resources. So we try to do direct outreach to them. We actually hired a canvassing team to go door to door and just hand out flyers and answer their questions. We set up a hotline specifically for questions regarding the technical assistance program and also for the grant program, as well as a separate email address, just have people monitoring it throughout the day. We have a live chat feature on our website. We do social media posts. We've done radio interviews. We kind of try to hit it from all around, and we listen to our council members in the sense that, if they feel that, for example, our grant fund application deadline, we ended up extending it because a couple of council members said, hey, I don't think I got enough outreach in this area. There were some businesses that didn't know about the opportunity. Can we accommodate them? So just extended a little more. So it's really just about, for us, direct outreach and being accessible. We've also created different satellite office spaces in some of the historically disinvested areas of the city. Our main office is downtown Central Business District in one of the high rises, just kind of hard to get to. for a lot of the business owners. So we're trying to just be more accessible to reach those businesses. I think I answered all parts of your question. Okay.
Great. And then Melodie, I think you had also told us about an affidavit process that you're using for some of these businesses. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. Yeah. So this kind of goes back to, eliminating the barrier of having businesses submit their tax returns and financial statements and showing that analysis of their financial loss due to COVID. So we, like I mentioned, compile different sources of data to make that case on behalf of small businesses in the city. But just to give us an additional level of compliance comfort, we created an affidavit that just is for them to sign to say, yes, I experienced a financial hardship due to COVID. It kind of explains what that financial hardship would be, just examples of that for them to sign it, notarize it, and again, just gives us a little bit of extra compliance comfort with the idea of if a business owner is uncomfortable just completing that affidavit, then maybe this isn't the program for you. So it's been a huge help for both, the applicants in completing the application itself, and also just on our end for the review, not having to go through all of the financial statements, making sure they're accurate, first of all, and making sure that the math adds up, and just eliminates a lot of back and forth, and it's just creating a more efficient process.
Great. And we had a question in the chat from Thad Coughing. Thad, are you available to ask your question to Melodie?
Yes. So our city is doing small business assistance, but we're not doing nonprofits. So I was wondering how you're qualifying those nonprofits. Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, so they have the same criteria as the small businesses do. We just also ask for their IRS determination letter and either their business license, or City of Atlanta does a letter of good standing. We know, and honestly, nonprofits, it's new for us. This is the first time we've been able to help nonprofits. So it's been a learning experience for us too. And, we learned that getting their business license every year is just not something that is normal practice for a nonprofit. But in Atlanta anyways, they could get a City of Atlanta letter of good standing, which is kind of a similar process to a business applying for their business license. It just doesn't have any fees associated with it. So as long as they pass the check with the city, again, we're programming these funds on behalf of the city. So if the city's good with them, they're in compliance, they can provide their IRS determination letter, then they qualify for our program.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Elisa Douglas, do you have a question? Elisa, I think you're on mute.
I am indeed. Thanks. It's like I've never been on a Zoom call before. I appreciate that. This was in response to Tad and also a question for Melodie. I'm wondering, Melodie, and I did already send you an email, if it's possible for you to share your decision matrix. I'd love to see it.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Sure.
To Tad's question, just an FYI, City of Tulsa actually did 6.4 million to about 70 nonprofits. And if you have additional questions, I'm happy to field those, and I'm happy to either drop my email in the chat or answer those however you might choose to ask them.
Thank you so much, Elisa.
Appreciate
that. And thank you, Melodie, for volunteering your matrix. Next, I think James wanted to make a point on this matching part that Melanie thankfully added to the chat.
Well, I was kind of intrigued by the comment made about, if you're combining funds, say with infrastructure, and you're doing a capital improvement grant of some kind, maybe water project, can you spend the dollars in time by December 31st, 2026? And what I'm curious about is you could potentially bifurcate the project. So for instance, if I've got a $10 million infrastructure project and 1 million is coming from American Rescue Plan, can I finish that 1 million first and spend it by that December 31st date? And it would get a little interesting. I think the easiest way to accomplish that would be to actually separate them so that you could show that project as complete. maybe this part of the community, or however you would want to segment that infrastructure project. But I do think that if you are using more than one funding source, you could find a way to ensure that the work is complete for that funding source by that December 31st date. But you would have to get a little bit creative in how you document that it's complete.
Melanie, see your hands up.
Yeah, just to follow up, I completely agree with you, James. I guess where I was just commenting was kind of in relation to the question back of layering grant funds and matching related to grant funds. Typically, when you have grants and it's, say it's an 80-20 grant, you usually are matching at the same time. So I don't know if you can necessarily put the ARPA or the state and local in the front end of that. So that's just one to be careful because of that one city with the $3 million they were looking at using to leverage for additional federal grants.
Yeah, it would be a unique approach, but under certain conditions, I think that you could pull it off. But yes, it wouldn't be the easiest approach.
And Mary Brown had asked about public-private partnerships. Mary, are you available to come on camera?
Yes. Yeah, I am just really interested to hear more about how that's working. And I was curious if private entities are like providing donations to cities to make that work. I'm just curious what that looks like.
So I can only speak to some of the experience and the conversations I've had. And as an example, you could put up funding with your American Rescue Plan dollars to incentivize redevelopment of new housing, for instance. And if you have a developer who is going to come in and develop that property, you could put up part of the money to incentivize them to redevelop that part of your community. They will receive the benefit, and it will offset their cost. So are they donating to the city? No. But the city, in essence, is donating to them or incentivizing them so that rather than having a rural area out in the community being developed, you're having, a downtown, district being redeveloped.
Great, thank you.
Great, and hopefully I'm not being too presumptuous to call on my colleague Megan Sheikey, who I know also had put something in the chat about public-private partnerships.
Hi, I did. I think a lot of foundations and community foundations have been involved on the in-kind level of technical assistance supporting cities in that capacity, largely, particularly in areas that Melodie spoke about in terms of training for small businesses, assistance on legal matters, and also providing fiscal sponsorship for nonprofits. But I do think it's an important time, and we can share examples ahead, but I do think it's an important time to meet with your funding potential collaborators or ones the city has worked with for many years to see if there are opportunities to pool funds and match opportunities, which is typically of interest to many foundations who are already invested in your communities. That their ability to leverage these federal funding opportunities, I think, is very exciting to many of them.
Thank you. And if others have been partnering with either the corporate or philanthropic community, we'd love to hear examples of that. Darcel Campbell, if you're still on, we'd love to take your question. Do you want to come on camera? Or they can. So Darcel's question was, we're using funds for, oh, there you are, Darcel. I'll let you say it.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. So the city of Las Vegas here, and we've we've awarded our dollars and some for capital projects. So one of our goals, of course, is to ensure that those investments remain in the community for quite some time. And we were thinking about, deed restrictions, and just we didn't see where Treasury had mentioned anything about an affordability period or something like that. And just wanted to see if there's any ideas out there to make sure that, we're not investing in these assets that can be turned around and sold in a short term.
Well, I can provide my perspective. And this was something that I did talk with another community about. It wasn't this specifically, but it was similar. And they were, you could set these up as loans that could be forgiven in the future. And as part of those loan terms, you could set timelines that they have to be used for this public purpose. And if they meet the criteria, then that loan could be forgiven in the future, for instance.
Other cities from to deal with this?
That's a great idea. We'll definitely put that one on the table as well. Thank you.
And Melodie had asked about duplication of benefits. How are other cities ensuring there's no duplication of benefits for program participants? Has anyone encountered that issue or figured out a creative way to put that control in place?
And I could just add a little. So the best way that we've been able to figure out how to ensure is we created a form where a business or a program participant will just declare what other sources of funding that they received, what the source of funding was and what they spent it on. But again, to ensure it, we have to ask for additional documentation. So we have to ask for, if it's PPP, then the loan agreement or the award letter. And then we ask for proof that the funds were received. So just like a screenshot of their bank statement, but then also proof that the funds were spent. So if they spent it on payroll over the course of 10 months, then we need to see 10 months worth of payroll records. And it's just a lot of documentation. And it's hard for both the business owners to come up with and also for our reviewers to review. So I'm just curious if any other cities have a better way to, I guess, a more efficient way to go about it.
I want to make sure that if any other cities want to speak up, they get the opportunity, but I can put forward my 2 cents. So the duplication of benefit, traditionally, when I hear duplication of benefit, I think of funding, the same purpose in funding being spent from more than one source. Like how can you demonstrate that the money you spent for what you spent on for American Rescue Plan wasn't also receiving money from the CARES Act, for instance. And one way that we've done that is just by expenditure mapping, which is basically taking all of those different funding sources, being able to demonstrate what they went to and having that in one report so that you can easily demonstrate that you didn't spend a CARES dollar and an ARPA dollar on the same thing. But I think what you're talking about here is really within programs, how do you avoid duplication? And I think that's going to depend on the type of program you're running. If you're dealing with small businesses, then you're going to have a different approach than if you're dealing with individuals, for instance. And that kind of starts to venture into fraud, waste, and abuse, which actually is probably our next content workshop, if I remember correctly, Jamie.
On the calendar.
Yes. So anyway, if you have a more specific program in mind about how you want to avoid and demonstrate there's no duplication, then maybe we could kick around some ideas, but it is going to be unique depending on the purpose of the funds.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. We can maybe talk offline about it. I'd love to pick your brain about a specific program, but thank you.
I think we're coming up on time, so I'll pass it to my colleague, Rose Gill, to close us out.
Great, thank you so much. And I know that questions are still pouring in, and as we indicated in the chat, it is not too late to continue to submit questions. Please do that on our E311 website, and the link to that has been posted in the chat a few times, but feel free to reach out to myself or Jamie if you have any issues getting through to us. I really want to thank James and Combre for this comprehensive information and guidance that they provided today. And I think that we all want to also do a special shout out to Melodie Eccles for sharing her experience from the City of Atlanta. And so on behalf of Bloomberg Philanthropies and the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Dave Burns, Laura Waxman, who are also on the call, please keep the questions coming, the ideas coming, and we look forward to seeing you on several upcoming workshops. And specifically on June 9th, we're having a workshop on federal funding available for resiliency efforts. And on June 30th, there's a workshop on ARPA funds to bolster municipal staff capacity. And then we have a couple of others in the hopper for July, including on record keeping and fraud avoidance, as has been alluded to. And we'll send fresh emails notifying folks about those in the upcoming days and weeks. So thanks again very much, and best of luck with all of this fantastic work that you're doing.
Thank you.